One of the questions that has motivated my research over the last 20 or 30 years is, what is it that we human beings think we are, and with what consequences? Now, in the next few minutes, I'm going to take you on a tour of the last 600 years of intellectual development in the European tradition. I'll begin somewhat arbitrarily in the European Renaissance. Of course, the world's major civilizations and spiritual traditions have all got their own ways of understanding things, but I'll be concentrating upon the European case because that's what I'm most familiar with. And I'll be ending with some information about work I'm currently involved in the health humanities, where we've been using the arts and humanities to enhance the well-being and social connectedness of people who've been diagnosed with so-called mental disorders. So, let us begin somewhat arbitrarily with Leonardo da Vinci, the original Renaissance man par excellence, looking rather stony-faced because he's a statue there. Now, up to that point, in intellectual life, a lot of it was text-based. If you were studying medicine, you'd be studying the work of Galen and Hippocrates, philosophy, drama, literature. A lot of this would be drawn from classical antiquity. Now, what was happening round about the time of the European Renaissance is that the study of human beings started becoming an observational and investigative discipline. Here's some examples of things that Leonardo observed in his dissections. There's the contents of the abdomen. I don't know if you can quite work out the detail of that from the back. There's the womb down there, but there's something missing. There's no fallopian tubes. Gabriel Fallopius didn't come along and invent those till about 50 years later. The spleen and the liver are around about the same size. Now, typically nowadays we draw the liver much larger and the spleen much smaller, but the spleen was an important actor in human moral and social affairs in those days, venting one's spleen, being splenetic and so on. Now, the next slide is slightly Certificate 18 rated, so if you're under 18, please get your parents to look away now. The detail might be a wee bit small for you to see at the back, but there's a sort of cross-sectional diagram of a couple doing something rude. 2 urethra down the man's organ, because, of course, urine and the seeds of the soul couldn't be mixed. The origins of life itself. Here's the little fetal cosmonaut in its little environment there. Things looked, to some extent, the same, but they look subtly different from what we believe human anatomy looks like nowadays. It only really started getting like modern anatomy with this guy a little bit later, Andreas Vesalius. There he is in his own book, Dissecting the Arm. What's important, though, aside from these technical details, is that the study of human beings is becoming an observational, rational process. None of this stuff about how we're in the mind of God and God's in the mind of man, so dissection won't tell you very much. No, it's something that's got to be observed. And similarly, in the larger body politic, too. Here's Niccolo Machiavelli, who was never terribly successful in his personal life. He didn't practice what he preached, but is much written about Prince. If you capture your enemy, should you kill him or should you confiscate his property? Well, says Machiavelli, of course, you should kill him, because his loved ones will forgive the loss of their relative much more readily than they will forgive the loss of their inheritance. So, politics in the mass, and then we've got Desiderius Erasmus, again, around about the same time, 1400s, 1500s. Through his concept of civility, on civility in children, he described how individual conduct could be rationally managed to achieve greater civility. His work is full of advice like, don't blow your nose on the tablecloth, don't take bites out of food and then put it back in the communal dish, don't spit at the dinner table, or if you must spit, turn away and do so in a corner. How you should conduct yourself if you're the son of the nobility entering a brothel. You know, these sorts of areas of etiquette were very important. Human conduct itself is subject increasingly to a rational worldview and a rational strategic management. There were a couple of other things that happened that pushed forward this rational, material, strategic view of human beings and their place in the world. The first, the Reformation, Henry VIII decided that he'd rather be a Protestant because the Pope wouldn't give him a divorce. The English Civil War and Glorious Revolution. There's Oliver Cromwell, warts and all. Now, these were like an Anthropocene mass extinction event when it came to spiritual entities and the supernatural. All those little fellas with pointy tails and forks, angels, demons, demonic possession, incubi and succubi flying through the night, witches on broomsticks. All of these were more or less wiped out. All those little fellas, lads and ladesses that you see carved into medieval churches like Sheila na gig and Jack in the Green. You know, I sometimes tease my Christian colleagues with the observation that Christianity only really became a monotheistic religion in about 1650. But all of these characters were wiped out, and they were replaced by a new rational parliamentary polity. A new model army where rank was based on experience and merit. Unusual experiences, bizarre behaviour became progressively medical matters rather than spiritual ones. The radical Puritan sects, who aligned themselves with the party responsible for executing King Charles, were starting to voice radical egalitarian opinions that everybody, even the poorest person, should have a voice in government. Whew, blimey. The world was getting cleaned up both epistemologically and politically just in time for the Enlightenment. Here's one of my heroes, Adolphe Quetelet. He came along a little bit later, 1796 to 1874. You may not have heard of him, but you've probably come across some of his ideas. You know the phrase, "the facts will speak for themselves"? Well, that was Quetelet. Come across the idea of a body mass index? Well, that was him. Those of you who've done much research methods will have probably come across the idea of the normal distribution. That was him. He didn't invent it, that was Gauss, but he certainly popularized its use in describing human affairs. He was fascinated by statistics, and by the early 19th century, we had in place mechanisms for collecting information. He was preoccupied with things like rates of murder, rates of suicide, rates of death from tuberculosis or cholera, the chest circumferences of Scottish Army recruits. All of these statistics displayed a remarkable regularity. They tended to cluster around a central tendency, hence the use of the normal distribution. The sciences of humanity were becoming increasingly mathematical, and mathematics, by the way, was increasingly becoming a consumer item. It wasn't just an elite interest anymore, it was something that most reasonably well-educated people could do. A little earlier, John Napier had come up with notions like logarithms, like Napier's bones, an early version of the pocket calculator. Napier also popularized the use of the decimal point. Once you got a rational decimal system of numbers, and you didn't worry about dozens and scores, and 20s, or groups of 3 or something like that, it meant that mathematics, because of the notation and the calculation aids, was much easier to do. So we had increasingly then a mathematical understanding of the human condition and human beings' place in the universe. And then along came this fella, Auguste Comte, who foresaw a time when metaphysics would be completely eradicated from human knowledge. What we would have, he said, is a form of knowledge which was positive, a form of knowledge which could be verified by sensory data, hence the term positivism. Quetelet, by the way, talked about social physics. Comte talked about sociology. He even started designing costumes for the new sociologist priest caste, which would emerge. They even started building positivist temples, and one or two of them still exist in various parts of the world, rather optimistically. Claude Bernard, "Why think when you can experiment?" was one of his mottos. He did a lot of pioneering work in the late 19th century on diabetes, on the use of animal models to explore human physiological processes and anatomy. Even at the time, his work on animals was seen to be exceptionally cruel. In fact, his wife left him and became a major animal rights campaigner. So, the engine house of medicine was no longer the surgeon's craft or the physician's bedside manner. The engine house of the science of humanity was increasingly the laboratory. And here is Henry Maudsley, who gave his name to the Maudsley Institute in London, alienist, psychiatrist. And he foresaw a time when psychiatry would be subsumed within the new biological sciences, that madness wasn't just a matter of what people said or thought or did. You could actually see it in their anatomy. You could see it in the way they walked, peculiarities of gait. You could see it in the shape of the head, the shape of the face, the nature of the hairline. Biological keys to madness would soon be in our grasp. This kind of scientific optimism was true across a variety of disciplines. Here's Lord Kelvin, who gave a famous speech at the Royal Society in 1900. What's the state of physics at turn of century? Well, we've nearly finished it. We know the basic laws of the universe, and we're just filling in some of the details. Black body radiation problem, Michelson-Morley experiment are still puzzles, but we'll fix them soon. Now, very shortly after that, as I'm sure many of you know, Albert Einstein, hey everybody, space is curved. And Kelvin's optimism was perhaps a little premature. As physics became perhaps less determinate and more quantum, even so the human sciences, the medical sciences, were becoming increasingly oriented towards science. Here's Austin Bradford Hill, who pioneered randomized controlled trials in medicine around about the middle years of the 20th century. Medicine came a little bit late to the scientific party, but randomized controlled trials, streptomycin in the treatment of tuberculosis, randomized controlled trials are the gold standard in medicine. And after all, if you take a drug or have an operation, it might be rather nice to know that you do better than the control group. And so would doctors treating you, and so would the person paying for it, perhaps most importantly. There's this increasingly scientific worldview. And yet, here's C.P. Snow, local Leicester lad from where I'm from, who lamented the two cultures, that literary intellectuals didn't understand the laws of thermodynamics, that scientists knew very little of literature, poetry and art, and that this was a great shame. Snow himself was both a novelist and a physical chemist and government advisor, and he's usually seen in a cloud of tobacco smoke, because that's what people did in those days. Jumping ahead a little bit, this is a rather enigmatic image, but I'll explain what it means in a moment. Okay, we have a scientific medicine, and we have a literary intellectual culture that knows little of science. This was, for many people, a profoundly unsatisfactory state of affairs. In the United States, the Society for Health and Human Values started promoting what it called the medical humanities, which was originally a good deal about studying with medical students the history of medicine, the origins of ethics in ancient Greek thought, and so on. And nowadays, of course, a great many medical schools have programs in medical humanities around the world. But there are certain things that the medical humanities have tended to leave out. First of all, there's an awful lot of people other than doctors involved in healthcare. Nurses, occupational therapists, speech therapists. There's an enormous number of informal carers. Informal carers outnumber NHS personnel in this country by about 6 to 1. There's a lot of work in the creative therapies, people using dance and poetry and art and so on, that tends to be rather under-supported in the medical humanities. So what we've done, my colleagues and I up in the Midlands, have started talking about what we call the health humanities, which is a bit more perhaps inclusive. This originates from a project run by a colleague of mine at Derby called Susan Hogan. It's called Birth Shock, and it's about women and healthcare practitioners and sometimes their partners getting together to make art around the process of birth. Now, these are folks not necessarily steeped in feminist theory, but there's a curious reformulation of notions of gender. Some of it's almost quite suggestive. A lot of it looks a little bit like, Tracy Emin's Unmade Bed. And these are not trained artists, but these are people who are making stuff to represent and interpret their experience. There's another thing for people with mental health problems, practitioners and carers, that my colleague Gary Winship is doing, clay works, and there's little figures there, look a bit like the sort of stuff that Anthony Gormley does. Now, one of the things that we're finding, although our work is small scale, is that people's well-being, people's social connectedness, measured by self-report questionnaires, is changing, and it's changing in a positive direction as a result of engaging in creative practice. So this is an interesting development because there's ways of understanding the relationship between experience and what's going on in the underlying biochemistry. When I was taught about human biology, it was as if DNA was a blueprint, for goodness sake. Biological factors were seen in terms of fixity, in terms of invariant programming. The relationship between what we do as human beings and our underlying biology is getting now a whole order of magnitude more subtle. It's based on plasticity, it's based on contingency, it's about how, in a sense, we might be drumming our way to better immune system function, but we're also, in a sense, drumming our way to a more profound and subtle understanding of what it is to be human. Thank you very much.